My name is Joanne Madero, and I head the Corporation Securities and Antitrust Practice Group, and very pleased to have this august group of antitrust experts to speak today. And just to put a little pitch in, if you have an interest in corporation securities or antitrust, please let me know or others, and we'd always be interested in people who want to be engaged in these subjects in the practice group. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand it over to Judge Cavanaugh now for the introductions.
Good afternoon. I am Brett Cavanaugh. I am a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. It's my pleasure and honor to be back at the Federalist Society for another great lawyers convention and to moderate this panel. Our panel today is the consumer welfare standard still up to the task, or is it time for a better deal? And we are still in an era, jurisprudentially, ushered in by Robert Bork and others, where the antitrust inquiry, the competition inquiry, focuses on competition and consumers, not on competitors. And does that still work in our changing economy? Since the 1970s, when Judge Bork began writing and talking about that, we've focused on competition. But there are challenges to that model that are being talked about, discussed today. And we have 5 great panelists to talk about what the issues are, how they apply to the new technologies, the new platforms, the new issues that we're facing today. First will be Professor Dan Crane from Michigan Law School, who's an expert on antitrust law and has written numerous articles on the topic, and will give us an overview of the issues, the challenges that we are facing today. Professor Ron Cass will go next. He's taught and written about a wide variety of legal issues over his career and has a special expertise in antitrust and competition law. Barry Lynn is Executive Director for Americans United for
Open Markets.
Okay. He is, he'll describe his current title. Wherever he is, however, he is a pioneer in writing about America's new monopolies and is focused on companies such as Amazon and Facebook. Jonathan Cantor is a partner at Paul Weiss and represents many media and technology companies, so he obviously brings some special expertise to this panel. And then finally, Judge Doug Ginsburg has been a superb judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit since 1986, a great colleague of mine, who is a legendary antitrust scholar and professor, has taught at numerous schools, and we'll look forward to hearing from him. Professor Crane, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Judge Cavanaugh. It's a real pleasure to be speaking here at the Federal Society on this really important topic. I've been asked in my academic capacity to try to set the stage for a few minutes on where we are and how we got to where we are. And I'd like to make sort of 2 basic points. One is that historically, the United States antitrust scene has been characterized by very abrupt shifts in ideological perspective. Therefore, it would not be surprising at all now if we are on the cusp of another important shift in ideological underpinnings of the system. And secondly, I'd like to make the point that conventional left-right politics, as conventionally understood, do not fully explain the ideological evolution of antitrust law historically or today. So, to provide a very brief and simplified story of the ideological shift in antitrust law over time, let's start with the Brandeisian period, roughly from the Progressive Era to the end of the New Deal, though with some interruptions by other things along the way. Brandeis, of course, was the one who taught us about the Curse of Bigness, the idea that large-scale industrial organization is inherently a menace and a problem for society that antitrust law needs to abate. To cite from an earlier case, the concern with small dealers and worthy men, antitrust law having a goal of challenging corporate power and setting a level playing field to preserve not just competition and consumer welfare, but fairness, opportunity, and a society based on small units of production. During the post-war era, Brandeisianism largely gives way to an equally aggressive enforcement regime, structuralism, but one based on a somewhat different set of underlying assumptions. The Harvard School of Structuralism was based on an economic theory associated with economist Joe Bain of a sort of deterministic relationship between a market's structure, the conduct of the firms in the market, and the market's performance. And that gave rise to a set of prescriptions for a very aggressive anti-merger regime and such things as no-fault monopolization law. It's also important, though, to understand that the post-war regime of structuralism had a fundamental political concern as well. Coming out of World War II, there was a concern that industrial concentration in Germany and Japan had paved the way for the rise of fascism. And in the Selleck-Kefauver Act of 1950, Congress was very concerned about the replication of those industrial conditions in the United States. And this is something I think we actually should take seriously. And if you ever want an eye-opening, sobering read, look at the 100-page report of the War Department in 1945 on the IG Farben chemical cartel in Germany and how essential that was to the rise of Nazism, the monopoly power of that corporation, not only to the rise of Nazism in Germany, but also to pacifying the U.S. chemical industry in a way that stymied the U.S. war preparation as well. So this was both an economic theory, structuralism, and also at some level a political theory of how industrial concentration created a tendency towards political concentration as well. We know the familiar story of the Chicago School's rise in the 1970s, a greater faith in markets as self-correcting and robust, a lesser faith in antitrust intervention as solving problems of market failures, and in particular, a single definition of the normative goal of antitrust law centered on something called consumer welfare. This, of course, became the dominant view in U.S. antitrust policy from the 1970s forward, largely adopted by the Supreme Courts and eventually by the antitrust enforcement agencies as well. What ideological school follows or followed Chicago? Well, there's lots of talk in antitrust circles about a post-Chicago school. I put a question mark there because I'm not sure it's a sufficiently defined and sort of a concerted group of thinkers to be a real school of thought in that way, but there's certainly a post-Chicago perspective that, that criticizes Chicago as having overstepped, to put the terms in Bob Potofsky's title of his book. The post-Chicago view agrees in general with the principle that antitrust law should be focused on consumer welfare. There's some quibbling with whether Chicago was tricky in its definition of consumer welfare to basically conflate economic efficiency and consumer welfare, whether we should have a pure version of consumer welfare instead of, say, a total welfare perspective. But that tends to be sort of a fairly small debate most of the time. Overall, post-Chicago is simply somewhat less confident than Chicago in the self-correcting and robustness of markets, and therefore more willing to imply aggressive interventionist policy prescriptions. This has had, I think, mixed success in the courts and mixed success in the antitrust agencies. And if you're looking at the last 30 years, though, in terms of the dominant view, it's been some combination of Chicago and post-Chicago, with most of the conversation in the courts and the agencies between sort of a relatively narrow band of assumptions about what interventions are necessary to support and promote consumer welfare. Just in the last few months, we're beginning to feel the signs of a possible fraying of this about 30-year consensus on the goals and basic structure of antitrust enforcement. We're beginning to hear suggestions that from important places that there may be a different underlying ideological perspective that needs to be followed. In June of this year, the Democratic leadership unveiled its Better Deal document, hence the title of our panel discussion today. Some are calling this a sort of a new Brandeis approach. And highlights of this New Deal document, which is really sort of a blueprint for the 2018 midterm elections in terms of economic issues, is the idea that antitrust law needs to be reinvigorated, but not just in the sense of post-Chicago, more support for consumer welfare, really moving beyond consumer welfare. The document talks about challenging mergers that are unfairly reducing competition, even if they don't lead to price effects for consumers. There's a focus on leveling the playing field. It's a phrase that's used again in the document, much like in the Brandeisian conversation, and policing business fairness. So again, I think one characterization, at least, of the proposal on the table is to go back to a version of antitrust law that's more like the Brandeisian view of the pre-World War II era. And so that really sets the stage, I think, ideologically for where we are today. The last point I want to make concerns the fact that historically antitrust law has not been predominantly just a right-left conversation. It's much more complicated than that. There is certainly some truth to the idea that sort of more on the left, a pro-regulatory, anti-corporate view has supported stronger antitrust enforcement, and on the right, a more laissez-faire view has supported less antitrust enforcement. But that's only part of the story. On the left, there's also been a powerful view that corporate consolidation is a useful stepping stone towards greater government regulation and indeed government nationalization. This was the view of Eugene Debs, whose picture you see here, the 1912 presidential candidate for the Socialist Party, who specifically argued against antitrust enforcement on the grounds that consolidation was a necessary stepping stone for socialism. And today, of course, we see a split in the Democratic Party, and Barry may speak more about, for example, the New Americas being kicking out the Open Markets Project at Google's request, and the way in which that's created seams within the Democratic Party. It's not surprising that many of the so-called corporate villains, like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon, tend to lean left on many issues, and therefore sort of turning the focus on them on the left is causing divisions on the left today. Similarly, on the right, there has long been a view that aggressive antitrust is necessary to the preservation of capital. If we go back to 1890 and the very conservative Senate that passed the Sherman Act, Senator Sherman gives a warning to his colleagues: we have to adopt this statute, or much more radical attacks on capitalism are coming. This is the view of antitrust law as a band-aid on capitalism, as a necessary concession to popular demand in order to make capitalism work. William Howard Taft, in the 1912 presidential election, argues strenuously that we don't need to go the progressive route in terms of regulation, because his administration has shown how it is possible to use aggressive antitrust enforcement to solve the social ills that more regulatory solutions are supposedly going to solve. On a statistical basis, antitrust law reaches its peak during the Ford and Nixon administrations in the 20th century. And today we see on the right very different voices like Bill Kristol and Steve Bannon advocating versions of stepped up antitrust law enforcement as a solution to various kinds of economic and social problems. So as with many things, the left-right story is oversimple, and if we're going to talk about where we are today, we need to recognize a much deeper set of historical facts. Thank you.
Professor Cass?
I hate standing up to the microphone after hearing about the Curse of Bigness. They did tell me to be short, so I thought when I was I'm going to confess my biases first. When I was a student at the University of Chicago in our third year there, painters showed up. The building is a glass and stone building. The stone was gray. The painters showed up and they started painting it gray. And a few of us went and asked Dean Phil Neal why the painters were painting the gray stone gray. Phil Neal puffed on his pipe, looked up, thought for a moment, and said, "It's all right. It's the same color." So those of us who are conservative, start with that mindset. The one other story I will start with before I get to the actual remarks is the Irishman walking along the beach, stumbles over something, picks it up, brushes it off. Out pops a genie. Genie says, I've only been in here a little while, I'll give you 2 wishes. So the Irishman's first wish is a pint of Guinness that never goes dry. Genie says, easy. So there in his hand is a glass, drinks it down, it's full again. Genie says, okay, what's your second wish? The Irishman thinks for a minute and holds out his glass and says, I'll have another of the same. It just shows you that not every idea on how to change things makes them better. So I have 4 quick points about today's topic. First, the problems we have in antitrust aren't because we have an overly narrow focus. The focus on consumer welfare is a good focus. It tries to make things better for everyone. When we have had problems, they've been because we have misunderstood the facts of what we were dealing with, such as trying to break up AT&T because landlines were going to dominate. We didn't see cell phones coming. Or trying to break up IBM because mainframes were going to dominate. We didn't see microcomputers coming. Or trying to break up GM because imports would never be a factor. We don't always get it right. It's particularly a bad time to be thinking about a new test because we're now in an era where there is so much happening in technology, so many new things created, and prices are being driven down for consumers because so much of what is being made available to them is free. Second point is the new proposed test, the new Brandeisian test, is a real muddle. It's a bunch of different considerations all packed together, which are not things you can make fit together easily. It reminds me of Justice Scalia's comment on a balancing test, that it's pretty much like asking, is this line longer than this rock is heavy? You can tell people to line up in alphabetical order, to line up by height, but telling them to line up in alphabetical order by height gives them a standard that isn't very easily done. If I were advising Justice Brandeis, I know that's hard these days, I would tell him to come back and ask for his name back. The new test is anchored in part and explained in part over concerns for inequality, and it's much the fashion today to be concerned with inequality. The concerns, however, are misplaced as far as changing the antitrust test. Equality is going to be advanced more by having antitrust cabined and focused and narrowly deployed to help consumers. And when you see what makes things more equal, during the recession, incomes got more equal. During a time of burgeoning technology, technological change, and innovation, inequality grows, and it grows not just in the US, it has grown around the world during times of technological change. The fourth point is that anyone who's concerned about liberty should want a narrow, focused, cabin constraining test. You shouldn't want government to have a vehicle at its disposal, a tool that it has that it can deploy. That is a tool that gives it a wide scope of possible choices. Which businesses to go after, when to go after them, on what grounds to go after them. To the extent we have a narrow, focused, and definite trust for antitrust, we have a much better chance of having government constrained, acting properly, and not being guided by either its biases, the people who want to spend money to influence its decisions, or anything else that will divert it from the task we have in front of it. And with that, I will ask for one more of the same and turn it over to our next speaker.
Mr. Lynn?
Well, thank you all for having me today, and thank you, Judge Cavanaugh. And I thought Professor Crane gave an excellent introduction to recent events. One thing, he also, there was a request that I introduce myself properly, and so I'm Barry Lynn, and I run the Open Markets Institute, which is a new think tank. We're now about 2.5 months old, and we had been at the New America, we were a program at the New America Foundation until, as you saw earlier, we were kicked out at the end of August. So I'm going to start with a quote, and it's, "America was created to break every kind of monopoly, to set men free upon a footing of equality, upon a footing of opportunity." Now that was President Wilson, and he said that in 1913. Now, we started the history section before, sort of really looking at 1890, and that's actually where most people think the sort of history of anti-monopolism in the United States really started, with the Sherman Act. But, in commerce, we can trace anti-monopolism, as Wilson did, back to the founding. We could trace it back beyond the Declaration to the Boston Tea Party. Most histories tell us that this was a rebellion against unfair taxation. But if we read the letters of Sam Adams and John Hancock, we see something else. Adams and Hancock did not want an intermediary between the citizen as a producer of goods and ideas and the citizen as a buyer of goods and ideas. What they wanted, they said, was liberty to deal directly with one another without the British East India Company governing how they would do that. It did not take long for Americans to understand that fighting monopoly was also key to protecting democracy from concentrated wealth and power, and key to protecting the well-being and sovereignty of our communities and our families. In America, anti-monopoly is best understood as a way of extending the practice of checks and balances into the political economy. We see the political nature of anti-monopoly in the first major federal act against monopoly, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Defending that bill, Senator Sherman himself said a main goal was to preserve the industrial liberty of the citizen. He said that repeatedly in his speech. Another was to battle inequality. He also said that repeatedly. Inequality of condition, that's a quote. Inequality of wealth, inequality of opportunity, the inequality that threatened democracy. As we know, the Sherman Act did not work as hoped. By 1912, power was so concentrated in banking and manufacturing and communications that many thought that the ideas of industrial liberty and economic democracy were gone forever. But that year, the American people elected a new president who pledged to restore traditional balances. That was Woodrow Wilson. That was the guy started with the quote. And his mentor, Louis Brandeis, came along as part of the bargain. And they promised to update American anti-monopolism for the industrial age. Now, defenders of monopoly often charge Brandeis with being backward. They say he didn't understand that some institutions should be big. The opposite is true. Brandeis and Wilson fully embraced big when necessary. They embraced the promise of nation-sized networks and communications and transportation, but they insisted that these networks always treat all sellers and buyers exactly the same. They embraced the promise of the science-based industrial manufacturer, be it of metal to make metals or chemicals or cars. But they insisted that every giant face some real competition. Brandeis and Wilson also completely opposed monopoly where it was not necessary, in farming, in retail, in banking, in services. They aimed to ensure the Jeffersonian ideal of independent family enterprise and of the liberty to enter any line of business and compete. Through the heart of the 20th century, leaders of both parties followed the traditions of American anti-monopolism. This was true of Hoover as well as FDR and Truman. It was true of Eisenhower and Nixon, just as of Kennedy and Johnson. They were all essentially Brandeisians. It was this philosophy and practice that provided Americans with the freedoms we needed to build industries strong enough and smart enough to defeat the industrialized dictatorships of Europe and Asia. It was this philosophy and practice, by keeping business small enough to be governed by family and community, that provided Americans with the freedoms and independence at home that they needed to defeat the xenophobe and race baiter. It was, in short, this philosophy and practice that made America. In 1982, President Reagan's DOJ published new guidelines for the enforcement of our nation's anti-monopoly law. The new aim, they said, was to promote the welfare of the consumer. At a glance, this seems innocuous enough. But at the level of philosophy, it marked the most sweeping changes in American history. Rather than build market structures that protect liberty and democracy, the goal now is to promote efficiency. In place of simple rules of thumb to guide enforcers and business owners, we were given complex tests that had to be measured through the math of the economist. 35 years on, it's clear those changes unleashed the greatest concentration of power in American history. Almost anyone can see the economic harms in drugs and airlines, in cable and chemicals, in banking and hospitals and news media, but the gravest harms are political in nature. The concentration of wealth and power in America today is greater than ever. The concentration of control over the companies and workers who make and grow what we consume greater than ever. The weakening of the U.S. industrial base as monopolists sell off or shift offshore vital technologies undermines our national security as never before. Most terrifying, perhaps, is the return of the great intermediary corporation. And what, after all, is Google, Amazon, and Facebook, if not intruders into the markets where America's citizens, until recently, freely traded goods, information, ideas, and news? And today's intermediaries are armed with powers that no governor of the British East India Company, or for that matter, no Soviet planner ever imagined having. So America has come full circle. Americans today are learning that we face challenges much like those faced by the founders. Now, I truly look forward to working with all of you to resolve this problem, and also to make sense of the role that the consumer welfare philosophy has played in unleashing this power, and then blinding, to some degree, a whole generation of our best and brightest economists and lawyers to that power and the fantastically dangerous threats it poses to our democracy and our most fundamental liberties. Thank you.
Mr. Cantor?
Great, and thank you again for having this important discussion and for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to be alongside such brilliant minds, and I'm humbled. With that, I want to start with an old joke from the Soviet era. I'm sure you've heard it. So there's a big Soviet parade, right? And they're going to show their might and their strength. And they invite some foreign heads of state, and they're sitting in the rafters with the chiefs of the Soviet party. And they see this big parade come by, and then there are soldiers in uniform marching in step, and the Soviet minister says, "These are our soldiers. They are the strongest, most disciplined soldiers in the world." Then come tanks, big row of tanks, 2 by 2, and the Soviet minister says, "These are our Soviet tanks. They are the most agile and durable in the world." Then come the nuclear warheads, one by one, rows and rows of warheads. It says, "This is our nuclear arsenal, the most powerful in the whole world." Then, following behind them, about 12 old men with scraggly beards. The guy from out of country says, "Who are they?" The Soviet minister looks and says, "Those are our economists. They're the most dangerous weapon of all." Fast forward to April 2016, and there's a hearing before the U.S. Senate Antitrust Subcommittee, and it's talking about the FTC, and there's a question from, I can't remember which senator asked, but what can we do? What can we do to help the FTC? What can we do to be helpful to this effort? And so the first responder is a former FTC commissioner who says, well, we need more money for more economists. And then row by row, speaker by speaker, they go, what do you think? I agree, more economists. I agree, I agree, I agree. They all said we need more economists. It's not surprising if you go back and look at the antitrust paradox by Robert Bork. He says, in fact, if you look on page 430, economic reasoning is more important than legal precedent. And he says of the consumer welfare standard, which is the sole legitimate objective, according to Judge Bork, that the policy of consumer welfare provides courts with the principles of basic price theory as their criteria for decision. So I read that, reread it recently, and I scratched my head and I said, recent price theory as the basis for a decision. I thought that was supposed to be the law. The law as Congress wrote it, not necessarily a law as economists interpret it. What I've discovered throughout my career is that economists bring values. They bring ideas that are often very subjective. And although there's a lot of work and important work being done by empirical economists, a lot of that also can be subjected to disagreement. And so I wondered, well, this doesn't seem very textualist. This doesn't seem very adherent to the words of Congress. In fact, it sounds like judicial activism when you're effectively powering courts to make decisions based on their economic values, or in this case of consumer welfare, their view of what's maximally or optimally efficient for our economy. That sounds a little bit like central planning. And the FTC and the DOJ Antitrust Division are not supposed to be, weren't created to be folks to decide what's maximally efficient and to make decisions. They were designed to enforce the law as written by Congress. Now, people say, if you look at the antitrust laws, they're rooted in common law, and there's an argument that it was consumer welfare that was intended. But that's curious. One is, I'm not sure that is exactly what the common law said, but even if it did, does it still mean that you should hand off an open book to judges? In case of Judge Bork, he said it was the Supreme Court's obligation to decide what the economic values were and to impose those as they enforce antitrust law. It strikes me that, second, if Congress wanted to instill certain economic values like consumer welfare, why didn't Congress say so? If the economic thinking has been updated, why doesn't Congress rewrite the law? And what we have is we have something that's out of step, and it's limited, right? So even from the perspective of economics, what we're looking at something quite narrow. We're looking at a brand of industrial organizations economics. Richard Thaler just won the Nobel Prize for behavioral economics. But as far as I know, I don't think any of the antitrust agencies employ a single behavioral economist, let alone a cognitive scientist, or many of the tools that these companies that exist today are using. Second, if output and efficiency is the sole objective of antitrust law, then, and price theory is the basis for antitrust law, how does that translate to a modern economy? So let's take a look at an Amazon or Google, and they are rewarded by the stock market and the individuals who own the stock profit, not necessarily based on just by making money, but by gathering information, by growing and making long-term investments in size, and ultimately rewarding what Wall Street believes will eventually become a monopoly. And when companies make decisions, not necessarily based on price, but a desire to obtain data or information, that would strike me, my own personal capacity, as relevant in how the markets function. But if you focus solely on price theory, you miss those things. We also have lots of instances, and I've read a lot about it, about a platform, for example, such as Google, that controls the flow of information. And if it is so dominant, and then why not, and it will weed out certain points of view, and it's an outgrowth of its dominance, why shouldn't that be a concern of the antitrust laws? Finally, you take a look at Amazon, and we can say efficiency and economies of scale. Well, Amazon bought Whole Foods, right? And that wasn't a problem. People said, well, because they're going to lower prices, and so long as they're lowering prices, everything is great. Well, by that argument, why not let Amazon buy every grocery store? And let's say it would lower prices in every grocery store. Do we think it's consistent with the words of the Clayton Act to prohibit mergers that substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly, to let one company buy every grocery store in the country? But if you follow some of these arguments on efficiency to their logical conclusion, that's where you end up. And so that all brings us full circle, which is antitrust law is a law. Antitrust laws are laws. There's a Clayton Act. There's the Robinson-Patman Act, which is still in the books but never enforced because people don't think it's efficient. And I'm not saying it is, but perhaps that should be the role of Congress to decide, not the role of agencies and judges. Lastly, I am not arguing for no role for economists to play. I don't think that's appropriate. I think there are important roles for economists to play. But I am arguing against turning the keys over of antitrust to economists. It is still a matter of law enforcement, and if there need to be clarifications, that should be the role of Congress. And I'll finish with a thought from Judge Bork's book, where he said, when an ideology is institutionalized, it becomes paradoxically less visible, even to those who implement it. The basic ideas are no longer apprehended or controverted, and hence it becomes easier to move things further along the lines implied by those ideas. And I think it's a healthy debate for us to say, what are the goals of the antitrust laws? Is it appropriate for us to religiously adhere to a narrow economic theory, price theory, or should we be thinking more broadly? And if people believe that the antitrust laws are broader than they should be, and that they are not good for the economy, should that be the role of Congress to make that decision, or should that be a role of judges and agencies? Thank you.
Judge Ginsburg.
Thank you, Brett. Well, I was designated to bat cleanup, so I'm going to clean up some misconceptions. The history of antitrust enforcement from 1890 until the late 1970s was one of incoherence, chaos, shifting criteria and values, goals, that could not be really justified on any criteria because of the uncertainty and shifting, constant shifting that Professor Crane so ably described. Justice Brandeis's reference in the Chicago Board of Trade case to the purpose of the antitrust laws being to protect small traders and worthy men leads to a decision like, and that was, by the way, in the course of a very sensible decision nonetheless, leads to decisions like Continental Baking, Utah Pie against Continental Baking in the, I guess, late 50s, early 60s, in which the court says, well, the problem here is that the local bakery, Utah Bakery, is not as efficient as the proposed would-be acquiring company, Continental Baking, and if they're allowed to, Continental's allowed to acquire Utah Pie, they will lower prices and drive other bakers out of the business. So, in order to preserve higher prices for consumers, the merger had to be nixed. Now, how that can be justified on any ground, I can't imagine. It's not producer welfare in the long run. It doesn't, I'm not sure what value it serves. And perhaps later Mr. Lynn and Mr. Cantor can elaborate on that. They didn't have a lot of time in the first round, as it were. So we had a series of decisions that were really almost impossible to predict. The course of any one business plan or transaction was vulnerable to harassing litigation because of the uncertainty associated with the purpose of the antitrust laws. That all changed in the late 70s, began to change, I should say, when the Supreme Court in the Sylvania case in 77 adopted the consumer welfare standard in what seemed almost a casual way at first, but it was reaffirmed the next year in Ryder against Sonotone, citing Professor Bork in particular and quoting him on consumer welfare. And since then, there's been a gradual working out over all these intervening years of just what that entails. One consequence of which is the Supreme Court overruling 5 or 6 of its own precedents regarding vertical restraints and per se condemnation, subjecting things to the rule of reason that, as a practical matter, makes them virtually per se lawful because it's improbable that one can find instances where they're harmful to consumers. That option is left open, but litigation is expensive, so there are very, very few cases once something is moved from per se to rule of reason status. So what's happened is a gradual but continuous clarification of what the antitrust laws prohibit as thus interpreted. The number of cases has gone from 1,600 a year to fewer than 900 per year. I think no question as a result of that. And the agencies have issued extensive guidelines offering their interpretations, not binding on courts, but often respected, but their interpretation of how matters should be analyzed. The horizontal merger guidelines, which were last revised in 2010, I think it's about the 5th iteration, originated in 1968 when Don Turner, thank you, was Assistant Attorney General. And that was definitely well before the turn to focus on consumer welfare. But he brought that discipline. He was a PhD economist as well as a lawyer, and he brought that economic discipline and clarity of thinking to the merger guidelines in 1968. Now, they were based on then contemporary industrial organization economics, which was captive to the structure, conduct, performance paradigm under which concentration in markets was viewed as linearly bad. And so that has been largely displaced in the economics literature and the IO literature, so that we now don't shrink from having markets with 3 or 4 competitors and finding them significantly robust nonetheless. Now, what I think Mr. Lynn kind of blurred over is the distinction between monopolies, which it's easy to oppose, and monopolization, which ought to be opposed. Monopolies exist for a variety of reasons. In the late 60s, there was a case brought against Xerox in the Northern District of New York, private case, in which Xerox was charged with monopolization, held liable. The Second Circuit reversed that judgment, saying Xerox didn't monopolize the market for plain paper copiers, they invented it. There's a big distinction there. Monopolization by lawful means, if you will, or the result in a monopoly, is something not to be concerned with at all. In fact, as the Supreme Court, through Justice Scalia, said in the Trinco case, this is the incentive that elicits business acumen and investment. The opportunity to price above marginal cost, at least for a time. Of course, the whole patent scheme system is built on exactly that same premise. So we don't go around decrying every patent, or maybe any patent, as a monopoly, or at least not in a sense that is offensive in any way. The idea that small businesses got us through World War II, I find risible, frankly. The necessities of that war production effort required an enormous amount of growth and concentration in the relevant markets. Turning to some things that Jonathan said, I didn't think I would come to a meeting in which economists were criticized for being economists and for supposedly bringing complexity and confusion to an area where, in fact, viewed against the pre-existing jurisprudence, what they brought was clarity and a very focused and contained debate, which parties are able to meet by hiring their own economists, battling out their ideas, the economic ideas, and submitting them to the enforcement agencies or a court for a resolution. As to whether the common law contemplated, or the Sherman Act contemplated this kind of evolution that we've seen over time, which, as I say, and as Dan pointed out, long predates the last turn of events to economics in the late 70s. The court's rationale has been that the statute is virtually a common law statute. It proscribes restraints of trade. Restraints of trade were a common law concept that was reasonably well understood in 1890, applied typically to things like employment contracts that prohibited competition by the employee over a period of time and space upon leaving the employ. And that notion simply took on greater content, restraint of trade, as the economy evolved. And so the problems that arose were not those of an employer and employee, the employee leaving to set up his own bakery or barbershop or what have you. They became restraints of trade that were found in contracts involving large industrial enterprises. So if the common law is going to reflect, and the restraints of trade concept is going to reflect a reasonable understanding of what is problematic for the economy, or indeed more specifically if it's going to be what serves consumer welfare, the answers are going to evolve over time as economic understanding improves. So to take a brief example, in the 1950s, franchising became a widespread phenomenon. The interstate highway system provided an opportunity for Holiday Inn and McDonald's and so on to offer the promise of exactly the same product or service wherever you went across the country. The alternative was you could stay at the Rip Van Winkle Motel, which was a one-off in this town you're passing through, or at some other place to which you know nothing, and you buy a guide to get some kind of description. But if you want the certainty, if you like Holiday Inn, there it is. It's going to be the same, and if it deviates in any way, the franchise will be terminated. And that was viewed with great concern by the antitrust agencies and by the courts as well, because they didn't understand the economics of franchising. When that became well understood from the economics profession, liability for instance, requiring exclusive purchases from the franchisor was no longer a threat to the franchising system. Because what happens if you say you can't have an exclusive, you can't make your franchisee buy all the napkins from you, just give him the specs and make sure he buys napkins that meet the specs. Well, since the back end of the transaction is the supply revenue and profits to the franchisor, that means the front end, the price of the franchise has to go up. So it was just counterproductive to constrain franchisor to make them price all up front instead of over time. Behavioral economics doesn't play a role yet in antitrust analysis because it isn't sufficiently developed to provide specific and unique answers to the questions that arise. There's a large body of literature coming out of the psychology departments, and it's been, in a way, opportunistically exploited by people who have an agenda for not just antitrust but other areas as well, pointing to one result or another in the behavioral economics literature. But the literature has given rise to a rich body of biases that people have and that deviate from perfect economic rationality. The problem is that there are biases and counter biases that might be at work in the same situation, indeed several at any one time, and we have no metric for sorting out what's dominant, what's affecting the consumers in a particular area. That day may come, but it's a long way, well, it hasn't come yet in any event. The concern with Google and Amazon, which Jonathan mentioned, I don't want to talk about Google because it's a very complex situation, as he intimated by talking about the information part of the business model. But take Amazon. Suppose there are scale economies, and that might justify buying Whole Foods and lowering the prices. Well, there are no scale economies from Amazon's buying Whole Foods because Amazon was not a pre-existing player in the grocery market. It was simply acquiring a small player in the grocery market and bringing to it business methods that promised to lower the prices that were charged there. Does it follow, even as a rhetorical question, to say why not let them acquire all the grocers? It's absurd. We don't let anybody acquire all the anythings under the antitrust laws, and because it stops lowering prices at some point, it becomes a monopoly obtained not by business acumen and innovation, but by simply buying up one's competitors. Now, you know that perfectly well. It just doesn't happen. So you don't see 2-to-1 mergers, or even 3-to-1, very rarely even a 3-to-2 merger. So what this is hysteria about bigness. We have bigness back in the picture. It was 1981 when Bill Baxter, as AAG, said, big is not bad, that's over. And here we are again. It's just like socialism, hydra-headed socialism. No matter how badly it's failed, the ideas keep coming back and saying, well, we didn't get a fair test, let's try it again. All these other experiments were polluted. So to say big is bad or big is good, it would be equally silly. It's a question of what the reasons are for the growth of these companies. if it is efficiency, and if it has any untoward consequences as well. But just being big is not one of them. Thank you.
Why don't we get some brief reactions and responses, and we'll go down the line, starting with Professor Crane, to what you've heard from the others.
So I wanted to respond mostly to Barry and Jonathan, and actually I found myself in sympathy with much of what you said, but drew different conclusions. First of all, Barry, I agree with the idea that antitrust has a political role to play, but when I look back, for example, at the IG Farben case I mentioned, under the consumer welfare standard, everything it did would have failed. So I don't think we need an extra layer of antitrust enforcement outside consumer welfare to stop the excesses of a company that gave rise to fascism. Also, I think on the history, I agree with Judge Ginsburg that during World War II, it wasn't the case that small business, was primarily getting us through it. In fact, Thurman Arnold, the head of the Antitrust Division in 1942, wanted to maintain an aggressive antitrust policy during the war. He tried to indict Averell Harriman and the railroads. FDR said, "You're fired," up to the D.C. Circuit, which I guess was a job promotion for him, but he didn't think of it that way. And then during the war, the Antitrust Division told 30 cases against all the major industries precisely on the view that if you're going to mobilize a war effort, you needed the collaboration of big business. Also, on inequality, is a really complicated topic, the relationship between competition and inequality. I've got a paper in the Cornell Law Review on this, if anyone's interested. I just would say that it doesn't follow that more antitrust enforcement breeds more equality. It's actually a really complicated relationship. Just one example of this, there's been, in recent years, lots of enforcement against realtors for anti-competitive conditions. If you look at the income profile of realtors, it's about half the household income profile of home sellers. Who pays realtor fees? It's home sellers. That means that any anti-competitive effect is a progressive wealth transfer from richer households to poorer households, and antitrust enforcement, if anything, is regressive. And my paper gives many examples of this, where I'm not saying that as an overall matter, antitrust enforcement is regressive. It's just that you cannot generalize that beefing up antitrust enforcement is a solution to wealth inequality. As to Jonathan, I think it's very smart of him to come to the Federalist Society and say, here's a place in which you're not being principled, you're not being textualist, you're not being originalist. I think he has a point. The Robinson-Patman Act, I will concede that courts today are not doing what Congress wanted in 1936. I would be terrified if they did, but there's a principled issue there that I think we as in the Federal Society need to really wrestle with. Do our ideological methodologies on other things carry over to antitrust law? Having said that, I do think that most antitrust statutes are so open-textured that it's not possible to do a kind of textualism of the kind that he suggests. For example, Section 5 of the FTC Act, what's it do? It says that unfair methods of competition are illegal. That's it. There is no more text. There's no more context than that. So I don't think it'd be possible to derive any antitrust policy from that without, in some sense, doing what Judge Ginsburg described, which is creating a federal common law.
Professor Cass?
Well, I find myself in sufficient agreement with Judge Ginsburg that I want to limit what I add to it. First, I should say, Doug, that if you stayed at the Rip Van Winkle Motel, you would have gotten a very good night's sleep. But when we talk about the use of economic tools to flesh out the meaning of things like unreasonable restraint of trade or unreasonable interference with competition or any of the terms in the statute, the fact that we have tools that get better at helping us see what unreasonably harms competition, what unreasonably deprives people of the benefits of competition, the fact that the tools weren't around when the statute was written or they weren't as well advanced when the statute was written, doesn't mean they're inappropriate to use. If someone tells me to go out and build a house, and they tell me that and I don't get around to it for 10 years, it doesn't mean I should only use the tools that were around 10 years earlier. I can still build the house the way I was supposed to and do it better with better tools. The rule of law requires certainty. It requires principles. And an economy to function well requires competition. The best way to impede competition is through government. The longest lasting cartels are the ones that the government ran. If you look at the restraints on airline competition or competition among communications providers or any other enterprise, you look at the Interstate Commerce Commission and what it helped prevent in terms of competition in transportation, government can do a wonderful job because it has coercive power that mere agreements don't. If you look at the economy we have today, look at the firms, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook. You have a handful of companies that 40 years ago didn't exist. Most of them didn't exist 30 years ago or even 20 years ago, and now together they're worth about $3.3 trillion. The development of them is a tribute to a competitive economy. And they have made the people who founded them and came up with the ideas behind them and came up with the inventions they're built on very wealthy. But they also made very wealthy a lot of administrative assistants and secretaries and low-level engineers and others. And the fact that they have come in has also made a lot of new businesses work well, businesses built on the backs of those sorts of innovations. Trying to have an antitrust law that works, that doesn't stifle competition, but that encourages competition, is something that is best done if we stick with a fairly narrow and predictable standard for deploying the antitrust laws as written. And I think that the standards we've been using over the last 40 years have pretty well done that. It doesn't mean they've done it in every case. Usually when they haven't, it's because we didn't understand the facts or we were temporarily given over to the latest fad in terms of economic theory that reduced the certainty and clarity of the economics we were using. But I think by and large we have made it over the last 40 years clearer, more predictable, more understandable to those who have to deal with it, and facilitating competition, not inhibiting it. Last thing, and I'll end with this, the comment that businesses need to be small enough to be governed by the local communities, I think is both ahistorical if we look at GE and GM and US Steel and General Mills, all of which flourished during the period that Barry was talking about, but it also isn't a standard that makes sense or fits the way the law is written. The law doesn't say make businesses governed by their communities. It says don't let them engage in unreasonable restraints of trade. Don't let them unreasonably interfere with competition. Don't let them monopolize business in an inappropriate fashion. And I think that if we stick with that rather than looking at local control, we have a much more governable and predictable law.
For Mr. Lynn and Mr. Cantor, I have a question as well, which I hope you can weave in, which is you've both talked about change in some respects, change in the law. And whenever I hear a discussion of the law, my first instinct, my first question is who decides? And I'm curious about the roles of Congress versus the Supreme Court or the courts in changing direction in the law and what you would see for that, in addition to any other comments and reactions you have to what you've heard.
I'll leave that to Jonathan. But the, no, I think, and actually speaking of change, I mean, this is a, this is a tough period for people. I mean, there's people, as Professor Crane said, and as is evidently the case, there is a lot of change that is taking place in our thinking. There's a lot of change that is taking place in our perceptions of our own past. It's like, are these ideas that I've held in my head, are they, for a long time, are they the correct ideas? So when you suddenly get to the point of actually having to question ideas that you've held for a long time, it's a really tough thing to have to face up to. What I'm going to do, just try and do briefly here, is just clarify a couple things. Judge Ginsburg said that I had said that small business was responsible for winning World War II. Actually, I said quite the opposite. I said the exact opposite, Judge Ginsburg. I said that, and I'll explain exactly what it's like. What was the Brandeisian role, sort of a approach to antitrust, anti-monopoly, basically from 1913 up until mid-late 70s? You know, what people did during that period, one way to understand what people did is they broke the economy into three separate realms. One realm was for network monopoly, railroads, telephones, telegraph, electricity. And the Brandeisians had no problem whatsoever with big, with network, with monopoly. No problem whatsoever. They embraced the idea. They said, we just want one electrical system in this town. We just want one railway, perhaps, going between this point and that point. That's fine. But then they said, well, the people who control this monopoly, they cannot exploit the power in this monopoly to make themselves more rich and more powerful than other people. They have to provide a service. They cannot sort of take the power in this monopoly and regulate the commerce on their rails. They cannot regulate how people talk on the telephone. They cannot discriminate in the service they provide. They must provide the same service to every single person. They must focus on providing the best service possible. Monopoly, big, fantastic when it makes sense. But then you have to make sure that people do not abuse that power. That was basket one. Basket two, large industrial firms that make metals, that make chemicals, that make automobiles, that make aeroplanes. If they want to vertically integrate, are we going to be the people that stand in the way of the engineers and the scientists who want to bring certain things together, want to like eliminate entire marketplaces through integration of certain activities, through the process of manufacturing? No, we do not want to get in the way, so we're not going to prevent people from vertical integration. If Ford Motor is going to build a giant factory and turn out Model Ts, millions of them, so everyone gets a car, are we going to prevent them from doing that? No. We're going to embrace this. This is a fantastic thing. This makes life better. Big is beautiful. But in this case, in metals, in cars, in chemicals, we're also going to say, as we did with Alcoa, we're going to have 3, 4, 5, 6. We're to make sure that there's just not one. So big is fine. Big is wonderful. Big to go fight and beat the Nazis, go fight and beat the Japanese. That's fantastic. So I don't see a single Brandeisian ever questioning that. The difference between one of the differences in the United States is we had competition right through the war period with the big industrial firms. But then there was a third area, a third basket. And this third basket, as I said before, was for the retailer. It was for the farmer. It was for the garage owner. It was for the insurance agent. It was for all of the different activities and services where, you know what, maybe a big chain store might be better. Maybe. But part of what we do in America is we actually seek to, we strive to deliver on the Jeffersonian ideal of allowing those who seek to be their own boss, those who seek to have their own business, we strive to make it possible for them to do so. That is a purely political goal. But it's a goal that the American people have said that they want to achieve. We've said this time and again over the centuries. We want to have little farms. We want people to have industrial liberty, the liberty to use their own personal industry as they see fit. So in these areas, there was a different approach. We're going to keep farms small. We're going to keep retailing small enough so that it actually effectively was part of a community. Now I am old enough, and a couple of the other folks up here on this panel are old enough to remember what an American Main Street looked like up through the late 1970s. It was a bunch of places in which there were a bunch of stores, a bunch of retailers, a bunch of different places that were owned by people within the community. Today, it's not that way. Now, that was a revolution that took place in our midst, a social revolution. Now, who unleashed that social revolution? Was it the American people acting through Congress that unleashed that social revolution? No. It was a few people in some small rooms who decided that that was inefficient. And they said, well, we're going to let the giant chain store roll everything up. And we've seen in this country mass expropriation in sector after sector after sector. Who unleashed that mass expropriation of the properties of the people, the liberties of the people, the liberty to go and have your own farm, have your own store? It wasn't Congress. Congress didn't vote for that. When Sam Walton drove into Bentonville in 1950, he had $20,000. There were 4 general stores in Bentonville. With $20,000, he leased one of those general stores. The reason that there were 4 general stores in Bentonville was that was how that society was designed. We had seen chain stores before, the A&P, Woolworths, Kresge. But the laws had been structured to make sure that those giant corporations did not come into Bentonville and take over Bentonville, and that there would be 4 independent stores in there for people to buy and run and try and be better, try and do a better job than their neighbor, and do it well enough that you could actually put food on your kid's table, put a roof over your family's head. That was a certain type of America, but that was America by design. Now, the Walton family, the heirs of Sam Walton, how much wealth do they have? They have as much wealth as the bottom 45% of all Americans. One family with as much wealth as 140 plus million Americans.
All right.
That is a social revolution that was unleashed
Can we,
by those changes in how we do our anti-monopoly law.
okay, we'll do Mr. Cantor, thank you, and then we'll go to the questions, but
Sure.
briefly, and Judge Ginsburg needs, yes,
Yep.
rebuttal.
You probably just want to skip right over me, I think. I'm a humble practitioner among minds and academics and distinguished judges. And so, administrability and certainty and predictability are things that I deal with on a regular basis. And it's been my experience that as economics has become, again, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that economics has no role in antitrust enforcement. I'm not saying economics has no role in society and economics is bad. I'm saying it's become the singular focus to the point where often the keys are turned over. And that makes things a little less predictable for me, for my clients, because now in order to determine whether a practice is okay or a merger is going to pass muster, you have to do millions and millions of dollars of econometric analysis and spend a year plus at the agencies, largely convincing economists with data that your transaction is okay. And I think that's not necessarily an efficient outcome or predictable. And in some instances, it's not all that administrable. And I think the other couple points just to raise. On the Whole Foods point, I think, due respect, Judge Ginsburg, I was making a slightly different point, which is that in today's world, it is plausible that an Amazon could acquire every grocery store and still lower prices because it's more efficient. And so the question is, this is a hypothetical, but if they were to lower prices because they were more efficient, and they don't necessarily behave the way models would suggest a rational actor would behave because they're interested in growth more than they're interested in profit. What if they did lower prices? Should we allow that merger? And I think that's an interesting intellectual exercise because it suggests that if you take some of these principles to their logical conclusion, perhaps they appear to be inconsistent with the words of the law. A couple other points. Again, your point on behavioral economics, Judge Ginsburg, again, I respectfully disagree. The Nobel Prize just went to a behavioral economist. It's tough to say that it's not up to snuff to be used to determine and understand the behavior of consumers or others in our society in response to the way markets behave. And I think, what's happened is instead of evolving, we've sort of decided that we should freeze in time, perhaps the price theories of the 80s and apply them infinitely. And I think we've been slow to evolve as an antitrust bar.
Okay.
Goes to the role of change. Last point. I'm sorry, I don't mean to go long. U.S. is a role of Congress or courts, and at the end of the day, it should be the role of Congress. And if there are certain goals and objectives and things that should be done in antitrust, it's better for Congress to make those determinations. Is it for an agency or a judge to decide what brand, whether behavioral economics is up to snuff or not? That would seem to be the kind of thing. And even is it necessary to turn the keys over to judges and say, okay, you run the common law and you evolve when you think the economics has moved on?
Thank you. Judge Ginsburg, and then the questions.
The Nobel Prize for Thaler, and I believe the one for Dan Kahneman before that, were given for their seminal role in igniting this very vibrant field of research called behavioral economics. But it has not yielded a single theorem that's readily adaptable or applicable yet to the kinds of issues that arise in antitrust. That may well happen. I'd be surprised if it doesn't, but it hasn't happened yet. I apologize to Mr. Lynn for misunderstanding what you're saying about the World War II period, but I'm enlightened now about your feelings about the 1950s as the Edenic period, or the last good period, I guess, in American capitalism, when there were 4 general stores and no Walmart, as opposed to 1 Walmart and no general stores on Main Street. And there are obviously social dislocations to which you've alluded, attending that change. But the one you didn't mention was the enormous consumer welfare conferred on all of the shoppers who go to Walmart, who left those general stores because they wanted something different, a wider array of goods, lower prices for the same goods, and greater convenience. And to not take that into account is really very peculiar, it seems to me. So when you say that was America by design, I'm not sure who designed it. It seems to me the 4 general stores evolved on their own without any designer helping them do that. And the evolution continued to the point with the next step, which was a much larger scale for retailing. So we could go back to that. We could beggar all of our neighbors by depriving them of those opportunities to shop at Walmart, but I'm not sure why we would do that in service of your nostalgia. The Waltons may have as much money as the 45% lowest wealth in the population, but they came by it lawfully, and they don't seem to be using it in a way that you've objected to. I don't know how they use it, but except for building museums and so on. So I'm not sure what the objection is there at all, but I do think it's peculiar to ignore all of the welfare that was conferred. Bill Gates, one of the richest men in the world, I have no doubt, has conferred many, many times more welfare, more value on consumers than he could ever have acquired from Microsoft.
Okay, let's hear from the patient audience, and thank you for standing, and we'll take your questions.
Low opportunity cost to people.
My name is Devin Watkins. My question is for Mr. Lynn. I really don't understand your objection to Google and Facebook and things like this. Assume for a moment they're 90+% of the market share or whatever. I think people use Google because they trust the results of Google, and if they start manipulating those results and people lose trust in their results, they'll find another search engine they like. Or same thing with Google, they'll find another social network that they want to use. People choose to use these because they have trust in them. And
Question.
what is the problem with these kinds of businesses that people trust?
Thank you.
Google search is just an absolutely terrific thing. I use it every day. You know, I've been using it as a writer. I wrote books before we had Google search, and I've written books and articles since, and it's a phenomenally fantastic tool. Amazon, another fantastic tool. The question, and one of the ways to understand is that Google and Facebook and Amazon are very large corporations, and they have a lot of different aspects. But I'll tell you, so I'll break off a piece of, say, Amazon, and maybe we'll break off a piece of Google, and we'll just look at how those pieces operate, and then maybe we can start to understand part of the problem. In the case of Amazon, let's look at the book market. That's what they grew out of doing, right? You know, they started off with books. So 35 years ago in the United States, we had, on one side of the market, we had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of authors. On the other side, we had millions and millions of readers. In between the authors and the readers, we had dozens, hundreds of publishers. We had many thousands of retailers. Books, ideas, flowed through an infinite number of pathways between the author and the reader. Now, it was slow. It was really slow. This was a physical world. So, you know, it could take months for someone to learn about a book that they wanted. But if you're gonna, you know, there was no power in that system. Today, by contrast, look at what with Amazon, we have a single intermediary in between the reader and the author that controls the sale of 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, in some cases 100% of certain kinds of books. And they actively, because they are able to engage in price discrimination vis-a-vis the providers of books, they are able to treat every single publisher differently. And they're able essentially to treat every single author differently. They are increasingly functioning as the sort of regulator, the interconnector, the director of the flow of books between the author and the reader. They also have an interest in directing a whole bunch of that business into their own pockets, and they do that because they've vertically integrated into publishing. Now, back in the old days, if someone had tried to, like, say, if a railroad had gone into, you know, steel manufacturing, that would have been a problem because it's like you're not going to carry other people's steel because, well, you got your own steel that you're going to favor. Amazon is now the largest publisher of books in the United States. How did they get to be the largest publisher of books? They directed readers coming onto their platform towards their own books. They use, day to day, their power in ways that disrupt the flow of information and ideas between the author and the reader. They use their power in ways that extract wealth from publishers and authors so that publishers and authors have difficulty providing the same kind of books that they did, as many good, well-written books as we saw, 10, 15 years ago.
We have to get to the next question.
Yeah. Google. Just real quick, Google, Facebook, I'll just rely on, I'll just quote a fellow named Robert Thompson, who's the CEO of News Corp. Google and Facebook are killing the news. They're killing the news because they're stealing the revenue, the ad revenue. They're taking advantage of their position in between the author, the reporter, the editor, and the reader, to manipulate the flow of information and to divert the flow of advertising revenue into their own pockets.
Okay, next question.
Mark Middleman from St. Louis. Outside the scope of antitrust enforcement, there's a campaign going on right now against occupational licensing, which we might see as a form of state-sanctioned cartelization. We heard today a proposal to get rid of the McCarran-Ferguson Act, which is another form of government enforced cartelization. Do you see that leaching into the world of antitrust enforcement?
Crane and then Mr. Cantor.
So one issue is the scope of the Parker immunity doctrine for state regulation, which is actually quite perverse. Parker basically flips the idea of monopoly from its original meaning, which was a state-granted exclusive privilege, and says that's the one thing that we can actually go after in antitrust law. But if the state intervenes in a market to create a monopoly, it's immune from antitrust law. I don't think that's the right approach to antitrust law. I think there is actually, it should be a greater preemptive scope, particularly under the Federal Trade Commission Act. Again, I've got an article on this if you're interested in it, and I'm actually hopeful that the incoming FTC is going to take this seriously and actually not only on occupational licensing, which the current FTC has taken a hard look at, I think done some good work on, but in terms of the scope of federal enforcement under the FTC Act, there's a serious argument that the FTC could go further than the current Parker doctrine suggests.
Yeah, rightly or wrongly, the FTC has devoted substantial resources to date to looking at these issues regarding occupational licensing. I think there is a potential conflict with, or it's interesting that the federal government is essentially telling states what rules they can put in place, and I think those are legitimate questions that people can ask. There have also been questions about whether, given all the mergers and all the conduct that a lot of what we've talked about today, whether it's really the right role for the Federal Trade Commission, a federal agency, to be using its scarce resources to police occupational licensing. And I think, that's a question as much as it is an answer, but I think, it's a legitimate question.
Next question.
Paul Cavanaugh, I'm Senior Fellow of the Administrative Conference of the United States, and Ron is on our council there. But anyway, sort of a related question that was raised by Judge Susan Braden at the last panel on federalism, and that is with the exemption of the antitrust laws, and when we got Major League Baseball exempt. But the insurance companies, especially in the health field, have that exemption. And when Nancy Pelosi introduced Obamacare 8 years ago, she said we need the public option so that consumers have a lower, a better choice, because the other insurance companies have this monopoly, or they're exempt from the antitrust law. So my question is sort of a follow-up. Does it depend upon whether, if we do away with that exemption, the premiums go up or go down? Or is it just a matter of policy, we should eliminate it and see let free enterprise operate, and whether this has to do with also buying insurance across state lines? Nobody?
Ron?
Yes. Okay. No, I mean, obviously, what happens in the healthcare industry is quite complicated. The more you inject competition into it, the more you're going to get better choices and lower prices. It's hard to do that when you have a system built on a combination of restraints and subsidies. And if anybody is familiar with ordinary economics, the more you restrict supply and subsidize demand, the less well the system will work. And if you respond to that by increasing the subsidies and further constraining the supply, you're not going to make it much better.
Next.
Thanks. Josh Gilder with the White House Writers Group. And I wanted to bring up a merger that's going on now, which is the Bayer-Monsanto merger. And you've got a situation of a very constrained market here, which is like with massive barriers to entry having to do with the regulation of GMOs and pesticides, which are just hugely expensive to get through the regulatory process. Massive uncertainties if you look at just the political context and particularly the regulations in the other nations. So you've got a situation where you've got a horizontal merger going on among really what you've got is like 4 major entities, because I don't think BASF really counts, shrinking down to 3, of which the new entity, Bayer-Monsanto, will be vastly dominant. In this space, where it's almost impossible there's a lot of innovation going out there, but nobody can really get into the market because of these regulatory barriers. So shouldn't that add like an extra reason for scrutiny to this deal going forward?
Mr. Crane?
So I'm not going to comment on the particular merger, but certainly under traditional horizontal merger analysis, entry barriers is a very important factor, and a 4-to-3 merger, as we saw in AT&T T-Mobile a few years ago, may face serious scrutiny. Again, I don't think that takes any adjustment to current antitrust thinking. It doesn't take breaking the consumer welfare model to think that a 4-to-3 concentration change and high entry barriers would be something that under current thinking militates against allowing the merger to happen. But again, not commenting on the particulars of the case.
Thanks.
Mr. Bork?
Hello there. So since we were talking about horizontal mergers, there's a vertical merger in the news and a lot of discussion about that. Do we think, I would love to know what the panel thinks about whether agencies and courts should prefer remedies that would preserve efficiencies that flow through to consumers rather than using the blunt instrument of divestiture, which seems to be what's talked about a lot right now.
Well, certainly vertical mergers present a very different problem than horizontal mergers do. And particularly when you're in an industry where you have so much technological change happening so quickly, and where the lines keep changing between the different players. You have what used to be separate industries now blending together, and new competitors. If you talk about AT&T, and people as old as I am think of it as a phone company, you now think of it as a company that is in the advertising business, the ads buying and placement business, competing with places like Google and Facebook. It seems to me very difficult to look at this vibrant, rapidly changing technology sector and think that a vertical merger is going to present problems that you can identify because you can see one piece that seems to be very important right now.
Just in terms of where we are in the law on this, in 2011, the Obama administration revised the remedies guidelines to express greater tolerance for behavioral remedies as opposed to the structural remedies, the kind you suggest. That was actually criticized by some people sort of more on the left as sort of opening up Pandora's box for mergers to be justified with sort of little Band-Aid fixes that didn't actually address the deep structural problems created. But the Obama administration rolled that out as to a number of mergers like Ticketmaster Live Nation, Comcast NBC Universal, and Google ITA that were basically vertical mergers. And we can, I think, look at the record and ask empirically whether the fixes that were in place in terms of the consent decrees were effective or not. But in my mind, those are really empirical questions. And I think the consumer welfare model should be open to updating its predictive tools as we get new information. And so I think one of the projects for the agencies needs to be a serious set of merger retrospectives that we ask, what predictions do we make at the time the merger was consummated? Have those predictions borne out in the market? And if not, how does the learning from that feed back into the predictive tools that we make? That's a scientific approach to merger regulation. And yes, it puts economists at the center, but I'm not sure there's any better way to run the system.
Can I just add one thing here, and that is, when we think we know what's going to go wrong because we see a vertical merger that we think may be used to provide anti-competitive results, we usually have been wrong in that. Usually vertical mergers are done because they put together different pieces of a business that work better together. Sometimes the businesses guess wrong, sometimes they guess right, but usually that gets sorted out by the market much better than it does by ex-ante predictions of the antitrust authorities.
Judge Ginsburg.
In the 1 minute remaining,
Yes,
I just
final
want,
word.
well, I just wanted to go back to something Jonathan Cantor said because I think it was a seductive suggestion. If Amazon proves to be so efficient that it can continue to acquire different grocers and expand its market share, always with ultimately, as you said, the logical extension being, should it then be able to acquire a monopoly, the last competing chain, because it would lower prices? Well, of course, as you approach the number of competitors approaches 2 or 3 in a market, the promise of lower prices from efficiencies is discounted because the small number will find it easier to collude even without, to coordinate, let's say, even without communicating. And of course, as you said, in the ultimate case, it was a monopoly. Well, of course, at that point, they don't stop foregoing profits and just reinvesting. Being human, they will at that point take the opportunity to charge monopoly prices. So no antitrust authority in the world would approve that, or would have at any point in the past or future.
It's an interesting point. What about, how does it change your assessment if now all of a sudden pricing is done on an individualized personal basis based on the data they have about one's willingness to pay? So it's not...
Go on a diet.
You don't need one.
I've been coming to Federalist Society, this convention, for I think 26 years. I think I've been moderating panels for maybe 20 years was the first. And what makes it special each year is tackling important issues with people who are experts and bring different perspectives. So that we're not in a bubble and we hear all sorts of different perspectives. And I think this panel lived up to that reputation very well. We thank all the panelists.
Thank you.